Prevent Connect is a national project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, sponsored by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views and information provided in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the U.S. government, CDC, or CALCASA.
Media stream, the questions we ask are eerily similar. We ask, why did it take a grand jury subpoena of church records to bring light to the sexual abuse of over 1,000 children by 300 Catholic clergy over decades in 6 of Pennsylvania's dioceses? How could so many people ignore so many allegations for so long? Asked the prosecution at the trial of football coach Jerry Sandusky. And we are, by the way, based in Pennsylvania, so all of this has hit us really hard. We ask, why could Larry Nassar get away with sexually abusing little girls for so long? How could 2 major institutions, MSU and the Olympic Committee, surrounding him so completely fail at protecting children and women under their care? And that's the question. How in the world did we get here? Part of the answer is that institutions tend to have quick fix policies. People have little or no training other than how to avoid legal liability. Institutions tend to favor protecting their reputation over justice for survivors or safety for kids. People put an inordinate amount of trust in a credentialed leader. If you're a pastor or a doctor or a coach, you automatically get a free pass and people believe you are safe. Institutions often have a centralized authority. They're very hierarchical many times, and they end up creating a culture of enablers of those who abuse. And finally, most institutions have a lack of full system engagement in addressing the issue of how do we keep people safe in this institution. And this is a pretty traditional approach to child protection in the churches that we work with, you know. They have a dry bones policy that's often the courtesy of an insurance company. They do a couple of hours of staff and volunteer training every year. They might do background checks, and then they honestly believe that they have it covered. But they don't. They so don't. Systematic institutional culture change requires that we move beyond education and awareness raising and into changing social norms, values, behaviors. At the same time, we need to be creating policies and practices that sustain a positive shift. And so the core curriculum that we designed is changing congregational or organizational culture in 5 key areas. And to us, this culture change is really the core work of social movement building. We want to engage the entire congregation or organization. We want to shift the culture from a reactive to a proactive stance on CSA prevention. And we want to build infrastructure to sustain that shift. So a basic definition of culture is that it's, group norms of behavior and the underlying shared values and customs and traditions, narratives that hold those norms in place, right? So those norms then exist within some kind of structural container that includes things like policies and practices, but there's also a legislative container. For example, statute of limitation reform for child sexual abuse. There's a regulatory container, mandated reporting laws. So they exist within containers. So generally then, faith communities have, and other organizations, in terms of culture, there's a key set of ideas, there's a certain language, there's a way people talk to each other within that organization. There's a set of norms, there's a set of values, and then there is a system of rewards and penalties that are sometimes direct but very often indirect. If you violate one of those indirect norms in the culture, you will know about it in short order because much of it is not in any kind of employee manual. It is learned behavior. So this is just a question that we wanted to put out there for you to respond to, because if anybody really wants to do culture change work, asking yourself these kind of questions and getting answers is really a good place to start. So we'll come back to your responses on this, but right now we're just asking you to think about what are the core narratives or values, belief systems, norms of communities or organizations you work with, or maybe it's your own organization. Think about culture in your own organization. What are those norms and beliefs and narratives and values? So you can just use the text chat to respond. One of the tricky things about culture is that we absorb it rather than learn it directly. For example, nobody probably taught you how to behave at an elevator, right? You go into an elevator, there's a single person in there, you walk in, do you stand and cozy up to that person right next to them? No. You stand a distance, you usually keep your eyes to the front, you don't make direct eye contact, so you follow these rules of an elevator, but nobody's really said to you, this is how you behave at an elevator. You pick it up, you learn it as part of your cultural learning. And it's so, so important to understand the culture that you want to work in, because culture is the operating system at any organization or institution on which your program has to run. You can ignore it, but you do so really at your peril, because no matter how great your program is, it will probably fail if it doesn't run on the operating system of the culture in which you're working. In fact, one person said, and this is a great expression, I think, culture eats strategy for breakfast every time. Every time. So in Safe Church, we've designed our work specifically for 5 buckets of culture change, and I'll briefly highlight them here. We want to increase awareness in congregations, have more open discussion about CSA. We want to create safe environments for adult survivors. We want to create safe environments for children and youth, and we establish a network of trusted adults they can go to with any concerns about someone in their family, in their school, or at their church. We help them do policy and practice infrastructures to sustain that shift. And then we help them to develop child sexual abuse related, what I'll call in church ministries and community resources. Churches will often say this is going missional. We learn about this in church so that we can take it out into the community and help protect children and resource survivors in our community. We're probably, I don't know that there's many organizations, we're one of them that actually has had a consultant evaluate the culture change we're trying to catalyze. We produced a report of it, and basically she gathered a lot of data from people in the churches we worked with, and then we held a convening, a one-day full convening of people from those churches so we could capture stories and comments. And it was really amazing to learn what some of the results were as we went through this multi-month process of evaluation. We found in our first bucket, and these are just some brief examples, that we were in fact shifting the culture from denial or apathy about child sexual abuse, and that was supported with data and also stories. And, people said, yeah, we talk about this at committee meetings. We talk about this at adult Sunday school. We have sermons on child sexual abuse. It's in our newsletters. It's in our worship services, in our prayers. That's huge for a church. That is huge to be doing that. And what we measured, by the way, in this particular process is the culture continuing to change 3 to 5 years after we've concluded our work with the church. Because we want to make sure we're doing work that sticks. So that's what we were evaluating. The second thing is, what about support for adult survivors? Is that increasing? And again, the metrics and the stories were very, very encouraging. People said there was a more supportive and open environment. Adult survivors were sharing their stories. Some churches had quite a few survivors in leadership positions on their child protection and other committees. So that was very promising as well. This is a bucket in which we were absolutely the strongest, and we're thrilled about that. That's the primary prevention bucket. So we give them curriculums to teach to kids that are healthy boundary curriculums. Some of them use what's called Circle of Grace. But we heard story after story, and we saw data that they're getting disclosures, or even better, kids are coming to those trusted adults in the church with concerns about something before it's even taking place. So we felt really good about that bucket. The fourth is the infrastructure change. And yeah, the policies and practices are being followed. Churches said, we've got hallway monitors. We now have windows on our classroom doors, so practical things like that. And I love this graphic because they said prayer and committed champions help us get there. So again, we're doing this as an imperative of faith when we work in a church setting, so we don't just want to teach them, we want to inspire them. And the fifth is the going missional bucket. And churches are running survivor groups. They are working in the communities. They are sharing what they learned with other congregations, which is exactly what we want to happen. And so as I conclude my part of this presentation, I'll just leave you with the question again, and this isn't a polling question, just for you to think about. But, if you want to do this kind of culture shift work, what are the specific shifts that your work is designed then to make in the communities you work with? What are your buckets of change? Ours may not be yours. You may have different buckets. And then most importantly, how are you going to measure the degree of change? We think that's really essential to start building more of an evidence base for what works in culture change. We've actually just published a paper that is pretty extensive about how we work and how we see culture change become effective. We're going to be workshopping that out this year, so you can jump onto our website and download the paper and reach out if you're interested in bringing this to your organization or community. And I just say connect with us. Got our information up there. We're pretty active on Facebook and Twitter. So I just want to thank you for your time, and I'll turn it back over to Ashley.
Thank you so much, Linda. So there's some great conversation happening in the text chat. You'll have to pop in over there and read through it, but some of what folks are saying in regards to that first question that we asked, there seems to be a theme that there's still that notion that, sexual violence, sexual abuse doesn't happen here. It's not a problem, in this space or this community or this institution. So that was something that I saw come up. It happens, but not here. It happens to other people. It happens out there. And so some folks are also talking about, this idea of there's lots of silence, that people are more reactive than proactive. So those are some of the themes that I saw, Linda. There's also a question that I want to maybe get to at the end if we have time, but Allie asked if you ever talk about purity culture in churches and the connection to rape culture. So if you want to answer that in the text chat, that would be great. Otherwise, hopefully we can come back to it at the end. I just want to thank you so much again for sharing that. And I really loved how you talked us through, what does systematic culture change look like, and how we're not focusing on one thing. We're not just educating people, but that we're really focusing on changing social norms, that we're looking at policies, that we're really being holistic in how we're thinking about prevention. So thank you.
Thank you.
So Linda, now I'm actually gonna go back in time, and Tashmika, if you are on the line and you want to unmute yourself at this point, I would love to introduce you and go back to your slide. So Tashmika, are you there?
I'm here.
Wonderful. Yes, I can hear you. So let me get your picture up, and then I'm actually gonna. I wish I knew a better way to do this, but I have to admit I don't. So let me just flip back through. So for everyone here, if you, we're really excited to be able to introduce you to Tashmika Turok. And let me see, sorry, I don't want to give away your presentation. Here we go. So Tashmika is a nationally recognized survivor activist working to end child sexual abuse. And she is the executive director of the Firecracker Foundation. And Tashmika has been the recipient of numerous awards, including Child Advocate of the Year 2017 by the Lansing Exchange Club. And I'm going to put a link to where you can see a full copy of her bio in the text chat, because there's so much more to say. That's the smallest piece of her bio ever. But Tashmika, I want to pass it over to you, and I'm wondering if you could talk us through the Firecracker Foundation and how you all approach ending child sexual abuse.
So thank you so much. And again, I want to apologize for causing all the ruckus while I was trying to fix my phone.
No problem at all.
I'm very happy to be here, and I'm really excited to talk about the Firecracker Foundation. Our mission is honoring the bravery of children who have experienced sexual trauma by building a community invested in the healing of their whole being. The idea of honoring the bravery of children really comes from the idea that it takes a lot for a child to come forward, and what we witness as survivors when children do come forward is we don't really honor that bravery with a response that matches. And I wanted to create something where the entire community would be invested in that response and in that healing. So as a survivor myself, I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse and incest. My father was my perpetrator between the ages of around 6 and 8. And I knew that I wanted to create something that had a culture that was survivor-led and survivor-focused. I knew I wanted it to be trauma-informed, and I really wanted it to be something that focused on long-term healing versus acute harm, like when we rush in and we try to fix whatever needs to happen in that moment. But it doesn't, a lot of families don't get information about how trauma can impact youth over the period of their life and as they develop and understand their bodies and understand what happened to them in a more in-depth way. And I also wanted the community that we lived in to be invested and engaged in what that looked like. So I wanted people to understand that if children are able to come forward and are asking for help and support, then we as a community have a responsibility to meet them where they are and invest in that, that treatment or whatever service provision they need. So we launched in 2013. Those are all my friends. And little side note, it's called the Firecracker Foundation because I used to play roller derby, and Firecracker was actually my nickname. So at all of our events, we have sparklers. It's pretty fun, unless you stand too close to one another. Then it's not so fun. A quick story about being a survivor who started this work not as someone who was a social worker, not as someone who was an advocate, not as someone who had even worked in a nonprofit around specifically sexual violence. I had a history of working within an organization that served AIDS orphans in Uganda, and kind of did my nonprofit work there. And so I would go into situations and I would say, hey, my name is Tajnika and I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse and incest. This is my organization. This is what we're doing. And then about 2 or 3 years later, I was sitting in a conference and someone stood up next to me, another participant, and said, we need to make it safe for survivors to be public and do this work. And I remember being shocked and being like, what, do you mean me? Because I had been saying it this whole time and I actually didn't realize that in the sexual violence and domestic violence field that it wasn't common to have survivors be public about their experience and also do this work and bring their full self to the work. So that was very surprising to me, and really changed the way that it didn't change the way that I introduced myself, but it definitely made me more aware of the culture that I was working within. So how do you end child sexual abuse if you create a movement that silences survivors and or makes them invisible? That was a question that I really struggled with when I was looking at what other agencies, the cultures of other agencies, the culture within the kind of the professional, and I'm kind of doing air quotes, you can't see me, but like the professional movement of ending sexual violence, but child sexual abuse in particular. There's a sense that survivors are, we're going to be triggered, it's going to be too hard for us, and that we, shouldn't, and that being public somehow harms the survivors that we work with. And so really thinking about what does that mean, though, if we're not actually taking advantage of the wisdom and the unique qualifications of survivors. As Linda said, survivors know what it means to be a survivor, and how could we not participate in any work that is supposed to be leading towards our justice, our healing, and our liberation. So what does survivor-led and survivor-focused look like at the Firecracker Foundation? It means that it's basically in everything we do. It's our board and committee leadership, our program development, our community engagement, our activism and demonstrations are all survivor-led and survivor-focused. So within our board leadership, that really means that we're not asking people who participate in our work to leave their experiences at the door. We want whole selves doing the work. We want their insights, we want their experiences to be on the table if they're willing to share it. We cultivate an environment that accepts the challenges board members might be experiencing as survivors doing this work, and that looks like a lot of different things, but it's about making the work accessible. So if we know that we have survivors who might be triggered, what does that look like when you're talking about board requirements and expectations? What does that look like when you know that a portion of your board or committee leadership might be dealing with PTSD or other side effects of trauma? And so really leaving space for that as a reality of doing work with survivors. And then creating policies that make it safe for all survivors to participate. So survivors who may have a history of incarceration or have a history that wouldn't clear background checks because of the way that our court systems work. So thinking about those things, thinking about our participants who have foster kids, and what are those backgrounds, what are the cases that come up there, and where we have to leave room for understanding what's actually happening in the lives of our committee members and board members. So in program development, we really believe that mental health therapy has to be rooted in deep faithfulness and trust, and that means consistently working with the same therapist as long as our clients need. And we use yoga. We have a yoga practice, but we really believe that yoga is already inherently a trauma-sensitive practice, and it's also a consent-based practice when done the right way. And so this is an opportunity for our youth to learn to say no and learn to say yes, and have an adult in their presence who will really respect their consent, which is so important when you've had your agency stolen from you. We also have advocacy services that are for survivors by survivors within institutional settings. So not every person within the organization is a survivor, but oftentimes it is really powerful to be able to say to our clients that there are a lot of survivors here who do understand what you have gone through in some small part, and are going to use their best experience to help support them, and that can be really powerful. We also have youth programming with a focus on healing and organizing in partnership with the Me Too movement. And so it's really interesting to watch how the Me Too movement has taken shape nationally, and it has really given our organization opportunity to really transform the work that we're doing with teens that is about healing and organizing, but it's also not just for survivors, it's for survivors and allies with the idea that they are the future movement to end sexual violence. So community education is another piece of what we do. We facilitate panel discussions with survivors and multidisciplinary teams. I can't tell you how many times I go to an event and they're talking about survivor topics around sexual violence or child sexual abuse in particular, and there's no survivor representation on the panel and no one's speaking to that. And I think that that is really important. We have a multimedia art show that features the stories of survivors. It's called Soulfire, and we do that every year, where we partner survivors and artists to tell a piece of their story. And then at the end of the year, we have a really cool party where we celebrate the fact that we're survivors and that we're here. And it's really a beautiful evening, and we really, I wish everyone could come because it's amazing. So we also do public demonstrations of support, and we definitely have protested. And we offer trainings on topics related to prevention, understanding child sexual abuse, cultural competency, LGBTQ considerations, comprehensive sex education, and we really try to be responsive to what the community is struggling with. We are from the community where Nassar lives, and we held a lot of conversations about grooming in the face of a lot of parents being blamed for what happened to their children. We have education programs for schools that we have put together specifically around not only mandated reporting, but harm reduction, and making sure that after that report is made that the family is held and taken care of within that community. So we do a lot of community education. So the one thing that I also want to talk about too is, like, we have this way about us that I've noticed is that we say things like, and we allowed survivors to participate, or we are going to go ahead and invite a survivor too, when really survivors should be leading. And it shouldn't be from a space of like an afterthought, and the sentence shouldn't be we allow survivors to lead. The sentence should be survivors lead, and how are we going to make sure that that is the norm. This is actually one of the pieces of work that we did for Soulfire. That's Harrisana, and she's also on our board of directors now. So this is it all goes through our employment practices too. We think about these same kind of principles and culture when we're hiring, when we're talking about respecting one another's roles. When we think about self-care, we call it militant self-care. And when we practice collective decision making and try to really limit the space where there's this hierarchical decision-making process, but we're a team, and we're all working to move the mission of the Firecracker Foundation forward. So most importantly, we're working to not replicate the power and control dynamics of sexual and domestic violence within the institution that we've created. And I think that that's a key. I hear that so often from people who work within sexual violence or domestic violence organizations, that they feel like they're living within the power and control wheel, and I really wanted to make sure that we weren't doing that as an organization. So you can't hope to inspire culture shift in your community if you are replicating the harm of the violence you hope to eradicate within your own organization. As an organization, we show up in alignment with our values, and that's really important. And I believe also that by doing that, we really give people something to look at as an example of what can be possible when we're showing up, again, in alignment with our values and not sacrificing ourselves or our staff for this work. So we can't fix everything, right? We can't fix all of America. We can't fix all of the problems just within our one little organization. It's really about another piece of that collaboration is, we are a community and we have to be able to collaborate and work together, and we have to, but we also have to recognize with humility what things we can change and what things we can't. And I think that a lot of the culture shift is not really, I think sometimes we forget that we're taking small bites and trying to move this mission forward from a place where we actually do have some control. I can't actually make every organization align with the values that we've created at the Firecracker Foundation, but I have said to people before, in this little tiny corner of Holt, Michigan, with my little staff and my little committee and my board, this is the way that we function. And that's, and we see the wholeness of our clients. We know that we have trans youth in our community, so we will make sure they are always seen and heard. We know that we work with girls of color, and we prioritize making sure that they feel seen and heard. Like, we have all of these communities where we are, this is our little firecracker culture, and ultimately we're responsible for what that looks like. And really that's the same for you and your organization. So again, these are some of our programs that we are running right now. Mental health therapy, that includes individual therapy and caretaker support groups. We have advocacy in several different ways. We provide pediatric medical advocacy within the hospital. Title IX advocacy within local high schools is just starting this fall. And we just started a trauma-informed midwifery education and doula program for pregnant and parenting teens in a residential facility called Angel House that we're very excited about, especially with most of them being young girls of color. We know they're also adjudicated or foster youth. So we know that if Serena Williams isn't going to get great care within the institutional setting of a hospital, that these girls are going to get not great care as well. And so we're really kind of standing in the gap there. And so we're also doing, and as I mentioned, community education. Trauma-sensitive yoga, individual sessions that are private, group sessions, and then we also have group sessions that are facilitated with a therapist for some of our partner agencies, which really gives our therapists and our yoga instructors this really beautiful way to partner in service of their clients. And what I mean by that is when you're a yoga instructor and you're teaching youth, you're looking at their bodies, and there is an education in that, because we know that trauma shows up in our bodies. And so as a therapist is working with them, that yoga instructor can really start to provide some insight into what's happening with our youth's body, which I think is really incredible. And then, of course, we have our team-led programming, which we have a teen club that's bi-weekly that starts with yoga, and then we just do a lot of activities. I have the opportunity to run that club, and I just think it's the most fun, brilliant club. The teams that we work with have so much insight. We've been working on a project that is basically everything they want their parents to know about their trauma, and it's been really incredible to watch them really think about how their trauma impacted them and what they want for their future. And then our Sisters in Strength Lansing group is a paid internship in partnership with the New York Women's Foundation and the Me Too movement. Will be starting next in 2 weeks, I believe. Our application is open now, but it's a paid internship for survivors and allies to work on a curriculum that's focused on healing and organizing. And we are so excited to have this, but we're also working with Girls for Gender Equity on this project, which is in Brooklyn, and they're also a member of the JDC. They're an organizational grantee too. So we're very excited about that and sharing those learnings. So what I view as an outcome that I think is really topical for a culture shift is that we view the relationship between the healing and the healers as reciprocal and interchangeable. So some days I'm the healer and some days I'm healing, and some minutes. And so I feel the same way about our clients. We have clients who come in with their kids who eventually participate in our board or volunteer roles. And I really view that as a piece of our community invested and engaged. And I feel really grateful that their relationship as people who are healing has turned into a trusted relationship where they want to be a part of our community. I can't imagine a better complement to the work that we're doing here at the Firecracker Foundation. And that's it. I mean, there's a million things I could say, but If you'd like to be in touch, these are all of our social media handles and our website. Thank you again for allowing me to participate. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to continuing this conversation in the future.
Thank you so much, Tashmika. There have been a couple calls in the text chat for you to run for president in 2020, so we'll have to organize your campaign.
I'm actually running away from any elected office, so just to be clear.
You're going the other way, okay.
Yeah, well, I think for the compliment, though. I take that.
Well, I just want to thank you again, and I mean, I feel like there's so much to say after your presentation, but you know, we have such a jam-packed web conference, so I'll keep my remarks really brief, but just a couple of things. I really loved the Firecracker, like the name, after you talked through like how you all approach it and the programming that you have, and like there's no better name that I think could describe you all rather than Firecracker. Like that is what you are, and I love that. And I just wanted to say, so I want to ask our audience, because you talked about, you know, people who are working in this movement, who are doing work to prevent sexual domestic violence, but feeling like they're facing like those same issues of power and oppression that make sexual and domestic violence, you know, possible in our communities. And I think that that's something that I've certainly heard. You know, I worked in rape crisis centers for many years, and you know, heard a lot of stories and saw a lot of things myself. And so I'm wondering from our audience, what practices are you implementing, or would you suggest implementing? Because we want to recognize that, you know, we don't all have power to make these decisions. But what could you suggest implementing in your prevention work to ensure alignment with your values? So those values that you bring to your work, how are they showing up in the policies and practices in your organization? And so if you would let us know in the text chat, we'd love to hear more. But Tashmika, I just want to thank you again, and really appreciate you for joining us today. And also, you talked about the importance of, or the necessity, I should say, of survivor leadership in this movement. And we will be doing another web conference on survivor leadership, survivors leading this movement and really leading the way. And so that will be coming up, and that's from Just Beginning's collaborative folks as well. So with that, I am going to introduce, we're going to move through Linda. I'm going to introduce our next presenter, Ahmad Green-Hayes. And as I get to Ahmad's slides, I want to tell you all that Ahmad is a writer, a scholar, and a freedom fighter whose work bridges the gap between communities of faith, the academy, and movements for racial and gender justice. Ahmad is the founder and director of Children of Combahee and has been the recipient of many awards and honors, including being named one of 5 supermen who organize around racial and gender justice in Black communities by Ebony magazine in 2015. And I'm going to put a link to where you can read more about Ahmad because, of course, like our other presenters, there's so much more to say. But Ahmad, I'm going to go ahead and give you the podium and ask you if you will share about, you know, I know like Linda, you're working in faith communities, but you're working pretty specifically in Black churches. And so I'd really love for you to share with our audience how you all at Children of Combahee are approaching this topic.
Good. Thank you so much, Ashley. I really appreciate that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. As Ashley said, my name is Ahmad Green-Hayes, and I'm the founder of Children of Combahee. I'll share more about what that means shortly. I just want to give a huge thank you to Prevent Connect, especially Ashley and Tori for organizing this conversation. And thanks to Linda, Tashmika, Ed, and Megan from the Just Beginnings Collaborative. I'm honored to work alongside such brilliant, hardworking folks, so thank you. I want to begin by contextualizing my work within a larger cultural movement, if you will, a cultural shift that so many organizers and practitioners have been working towards for a long time. And much of what I will be discussing will essentially be building on some of the things Linda has already said. I wanted to begin first by moving, if my slides can work on my, okay, moving into the objectives here. So I want to discuss the role of Children of Combahee in bridging the gap between Black church communities and the movement to end sexual violence and child sexual abuse in particular. I want to also name how Black church communities have historically and are contemporaneously working against rape and child sexual abuse in particular, and then underscore our programming, how you can partner with and or support us. And Children of Combahee is an organization currently funded by the Just Against Collaborative that mobilizes against child sexual abuse in Black church communities using womanist, queer-affirming, pastoral, and theological methods. Much of our board is comprised of preachers, clergy, people who have been seminary trained, who identify as womanists and are Black feminists, theologians, or activists and thought leaders. So bringing together a cadre of people who have been thinking about racial justice, gender justice, to get them all in a room to think about child sexual abuse in Black churches. And many of these folks on the board are also survivor leaders. I think that's important to emphasize in building on Tashnika's presentation. Our organization was named after Harriet Tubman's 1863 Combahee River Raid and the 1970s radical Black feminist organization of survivor activists, the Combahee River Collective. We're building on this long-standing legacy of resistance and healing and communal reckoning in Black communities. Toni Morrison, in her newest book, God Helps a Child, has a quote that essentially really struck me as I was thinking through what this project and now organization could become. And it's simple. She says, what you do to children matters, and they may never forget it. And this is something that rings through in all of my work as I am interacting with survivors, some who are still children and some who are adult survivors of child sexual abuse who are a part of Black churches. And that's the quote with the image of the book there. Before I move into my next set of slides, I wanted to step back because I think we're in a very interesting moment. We've seen hashtag #MeToo take off. Then there was also hashtag #ChurchToo. And so we know there has been an increase in the reporting or the uncovering of child sexual abuse cases in the Roman Catholic Church, along with various Black church denominations, including the largest Pentecostal body in the world, the Church of God in Christ. And it has become increasingly apparent that there is not a widespread public and national conversation about Black children and the sexual violence they experience both within and outside of Black church communities. And here I like to pay attention to the media. In particular, we never see images of Black Catholic children shown. We never hear even about Black Protestant children who survive sexual abuse. And I'd add that we also don't hear from other Black religious communities, such as the Nation of Islam, which, as we know from the autobiography of Malcolm X, also was full of survivors of child sexual abuse. So just want to think about the implications of who is the perfect survivor in the media's conception, right? And how that actually impacts our work in churches. An ongoing survey of Black Women's Blueprint reveals that more than 60% of Black women report coercive contact or of a sexual nature by age 18. We know that 1 in 6 boys are sexually abused according to national statistics. And then some stats say 1 in 3 girls or 1 in 4 girls. And then, of course, we don't even have the numbers on children who are gender nonconforming. We have a colleague, Anita Swaheen, who's working on a project, Memoirs, which is uncovering the ways that gender nonconforming, non-binary, and transgender children are actually impacted by child sexual abuse in ways that the numbers just cannot speak to. So and yet, in spite of all of these things, many survivor activists have pushed Black churches in particular to think about its complicity in rape culture. And so I just want to highlight this quote from the Reverend Dr. Monica Coleman, who's the author of the Diner Project. And she writes, quote, every congregation contains victims of sexual violence. Every church with women, men, boys, girls, or the elderly contains victims of sexual violence, whether an individual confides in the church leaders, family, or friends, or chooses to remain silent, there is no church void of the people whose lives are changed by experiences of sexual violence. And you can continue reading. I do want to emphasize that for folks who are clergy or who work in churches, I recommend purchasing the Diner Project. It is a wonderful text that helps think through congregational culture that is in line with rape culture, and how do we actually undo that through liturgy, through preaching, through the kinds of services that churches are offering. So definitely get that text. And so I should also say that I am a son of the Black church tradition, and I am a survivor of child sexual abuse, and so this is how much of this project actually came to be. And much of my journey towards healing has included this project and this organization. It also includes writing. If you're interested in some of my more of my thoughts on child sexual abuse, just look, go to my website, www.modgreen.com. I'm a huge proponent of therapy and fitness and boundaries and community, so joining forces with other children of the Black church who are survivors. And sadly, the numbers of those individuals are many. I'm going to move into a bit more in particular about Children of Combahee's work. We have 5 main objectives which I think guide our project and our work. The first of which is we want to give clergy, parents, caregivers, and other community members who are in some ways distant from the anti-rape movement the tools that they need for recognizing, addressing, and preventing child sexual abuse. And on this point, I'd like to say that in many churches, and perhaps in Black churches in particular, but I would argue in many churches across racial lines, the terms and the vocabulary that we use in the anti-rape movement are never spoken in these spaces. So consent, for instance, is assumed, but nobody actually talks about what it means. People have access to bodies, but nobody actually talks about what that means. Rape is something that's alluded to, but no one actually talks about what these things mean. And so part of what I'm trying to do is to make vocabulary accessible to congregations that otherwise do not have working vocabulary that is survivor-led and survivor-centered. Our second objective is actually working with the pulpit. For folks who are very familiar with Black churches, the pulpit is something that is foundational to the actual working of the church. Without the pulpit, you don't really have a Black church in some ways. And so how do we use this very influential space to reimagine the pulpit as a tool of anti-rape activism? And so the pulpit, some folks have argued that it is phallic in its representation because predominantly men, Black men, cisgender, straight-identified men have been the ones who have had access to the pulpit. For a long time, women were not ordained or allowed ordination. And so thinking about how we are pushing back the whole culture that has silenced not only women, but survivors who may be women and then survivors who are not women. Our third objective is actually to call on Black churches to think about the implication of theology. And so much of this kind of work takes place in our anti-rape sermon workshops. We have partnered with a wonderful, wonderful organization called Woman Preach, which was founded by the Reverend Dr. Valerie Bridgman. And it is a group of Black feminist and womanist preachers and lay folks who are interested in thinking deeply about justice and the African-American prophetic tradition. And we got together and we said, what would it mean to actually think about social justice and child sexual abuse and preach it, and put all those things together. And we came up with a wonderful anti-rape sermon workshop. The first one was last year. We're planning another one, which will take place in October at Princeton University. So if folks want more information, please check our website. But the main thing about these workshops that have been so powerful are that we're finding that many survivors are not just in the pews, they are also in the pulpit. So how do we give clergy the tools that they need to work through their own stories and their own situations such that they can properly and responsibly attend to the need, right, to speak openly and candidly about rape in the church? And so this is something that we're still developing, but I'm very excited to see where it goes. And the fourth one, of course, building on this, we partnered not just with Women Preach, but with a host of organizations And many of these groups, as you'll see on the screen, have been working around racial justice and gender justice for a long time. And part of my thinking was, how about we get all these folks together and think about child sexual abuse in Black church communities. And our partnerships have been completely impactful. And many of these groups have actually reoriented their own programming to attend to sexual violence and to anti-rape organizing. And our fifth and last objective, though I think there are more, of course, as we do this work, other objectives do come up, as I'm sure many of you are aware. But our fifth one is we host public town halls in Black churches where survivors are offered space to share their testimonies and find healing in community. And I think this by far has been one of my favorite experiences, witnessing survivors who often don't get space to speak their truths, given the microphone in Black churches, historically Black churches, many of them, to name what happened to them in the space of the church, either physically in the actual edifice of the church or by the hands of church people. So there's a cultural shift of power that happens where preachers, often pastors, they are in the pews and the survivors are in the pulpit. And so it's a way that the actual testimony becomes the sermon for the hour. And then the community together has to reckon with that sermon. How do we stand on the side of survivors? How do we stand on the right side of justice, right? And so those are our 5 main objectives that guide our work. And we are currently in the process, as I mentioned, of having a town hall, sorry, 2 things. We're in the process of having a sermon workshop at Princeton University in partnership with Woman Preach and Princeton Theological Seminary, which will take place in October. And then we're also in the process of planning a town hall, a national town hall to take place in New York City in October, again, around child sexual abuse in Black church communities. And so if folks are interested in learning more about these opportunities, you can reach out to me. I believe my contact info is on the next slide. Perfect. You can reach out to me at any of these places, and let's definitely move forward and think about partnering. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ahmad. And you had presented on a previous Prevent Connect web conference, and so I put a link in the text chat in case. A lot of people, it seems like things were resonating with them as you were speaking. You got some love on talking about the sermon workshops and also the 5th objective that you spoke about, having survivors actually, the church becomes a place of healing when they're able to share their story. So I want to thank you. I want to let people know that you did present on another web conference, and then Ahmad's contact information is on the screen, and you can download these slides. So thank you so much, Ahmad, for sharing about the work. I'm also going to link for folks who are interested, who maybe aren't familiar with the history of the Combahee, the river, the raid, and the Combahee River Collective. We'll go ahead and link to some articles so you all can get caught up on that. So I want to move now to, actually, I want to ask you a question. So another thing, Ahmad, you talked about that really stood out for me was that you're partnering with organizations that maybe aren't doing the same work you're doing, but they're doing similar work, or the work that they're doing is definitely going to have an impact on what you're hoping to accomplish. And I think that that's just so necessary and so smart. And so I'm wondering for folks in our audience, when you're thinking about the work you're doing and you're thinking about the community that you're in, who do you need to partner with to have the biggest impact on preventing child sexual abuse? Is it a person? Is it an organization? Is it an institution? If you would go ahead and let us know what you're thinking along those lines, and thank you, Ed, for popping that question in the text chat box. I appreciate it. That would be great. We'd love to hear from you. So moving ahead to Meg. Meg Stone is the Executive Director of Impact Boston, an abuse prevention and empowerment self-defense program that is part of the Disability Service and Advocacy Organization Triangle. Meg also serves as the project director of Impact Ability, an abuse prevention program focused on people with disabilities. And Meg has presented about abuse prevention in disability communities and empowerment self-defense at local and national conferences all over the country, and has also been published in numerous publications, including the Washington Post and the Establishment. And I'll pop a link into the text chat so you can read more about Meg. But Meg, I want to turn it over to you. And, you know, I know that you're working primarily in school communities, but I'd love to hear how you're thinking about system-wide prevention and culture change. And if you would share how you've approached that work and what you're focusing on right now.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I've been nervous about technical difficulties for the whole time. So the work that we are doing with the Just Beginnings Collaborative is not only within schools, but it's within a school system that is for students with disabilities. And the school system that we work in is called SEAM Educational Collaborative. And the students that attend SEAM schools are students who could not get their needs met in a typical public school. So our underlying goal, the goal that really informs our work, is we want to create teams and communities within the school that are trusting and cohesive enough to be able to support children that are struggling with the trauma of abuse, and also to reckon with the possibility that coworkers they trust or parents that they trust could perpetrate abuse. So that takes a lot of trust and cohesion, but also teams that are not so loyal that they fail to act when one of their coworkers abuses power. So what we did within the SEAM schools is we assembled a leadership team that included everyone from the executive director to folks that were teachers' aides and others that are not traditionally in leadership roles. And the SEAM leadership team came together to assess the community's needs, to define the organizational culture and values, and to create a child sexual abuse prevention plan that was unique to the needs and priorities of SEAM Collaborative. What this school is doing has many lessons that other schools and organizations have used, but part of what makes it effective is that it is unique to the culture and unique to the values and priorities of this particular school. The areas of focus that were determined by the leadership team were staff training and development, which includes training on ableism, which I'll go into more later, organizational policies, providing support and mentorship where parents mentor other parents around preventing child sexual abuse, supporting survivors, and also supporting staff who are survivors themselves, ourselves, I'll say, and also staff who are just affected by the trauma that students are surviving. And also really defining relationship, sexuality education, and prevention skills for students as a key part not only of the sexual abuse prevention strategy, but as a key part of effective education. So students learning how to communicate their boundaries is as important as students learning math. And that is something that we really value. So the other reality for us as we address culture change is it's both the culture of the organization and the culture within our society that informs the culture of the organization. And as most of us know, folks with disabilities are disproportionately likely to survive child sexual abuse and often underrepresented in resources and leadership. So one of our culture change processes is to really identify and challenge ableism in all of its forms, including reporting on child sexual abuse. So here we have a headline from the Indy Star. This is one of the most powerful pieces of investigative journalism to expose Larry Nassar and child sexual abuse. And here they are equating inaction around child sexual abuse to the disability of blindness. And there are these phrases that are so embedded in our language, a blind eye, fall on deaf ears, that equate disability with weakness and inaction, that they even show up in our work to resist child sexual abuse. So when we look at culture change, one really key part of our work is the ways in which ableism informs services that are supposed to help and educate people with disabilities. So I'm just going to list a couple of common norms that really inform us as we do our work. One norm is that people are taught to comply. There's a lot of emphasis in disability services and in special education on teaching people with disabilities how to follow the directions of and follow the wishes of people without disability. That's changing in many ways and in many places, and there's a lot of work being done within institutions, but that norm pervades. Also, particularly for folks with disabilities who require support for bathing, dressing, other activities of daily living, people are often touched without their choice and in ways that caregivers or others choose. People with disabilities have less access to sex education, healthy sexual relationships, and in some places of the disability service system, they are actively discouraged from both adolescent sexual development and even adult sexual relationships. So we are in a situation where we're not only dealing with the culture of an organization, but we're dealing with the broader culture of ableism that informs an organization that is set up to serve and educate folks with disabilities. Tajminka talked a lot about the importance of not replicating oppression within organizations that exist to challenge abuse and support survivors. So part of what we look at when we look at culture change is how the abuses of power that we are looking to challenge show up specifically in the practices of organizations. So some of the ways that abuse in organizations thrive is when leaders are not held accountable, either around sexual abuse or just around any other issues, financial issues, governance issues. There's not accountability. It's not safe to speak up, ask questions, challenge, present opposing ideas. Touch is not chosen. And people who are not abusing lack the knowledge or power to interrupt abusive dynamics. So a lot of what we are doing within this project is understanding some of the defining characteristics of sexual and other types of abuse and trying to create just the opposite in the organizational culture. So I talked about this earlier, and other presenters have talked about it, looking at abuses of power and concentrations of power with single leaders. So looking at power sharing as a protective factor around abuse within organizations. Another characteristic of abusive situations is that a person with power can gradually erode trust by crossing people's boundaries and violating their bodies in small ways. So in an abuse prevention organization, there are both official policies and the type of cultural characteristics that Linda spoke of that enable staff to challenge and question and have dialogue and debate about more subtle violations. Another characteristic of abusive situations is touch is chosen by the person in power, and it is not designed to support the needs and wishes of the person who is supposed to be supported. So creating a situation in which people with disabilities get choice about how they are touched should not be as much of a revolutionary act as it often is. It makes me very sad that this is our work, but it is the reality. The other defining characteristic of an abusive situation is that there is a culture of intimidation. There are very real consequences for challenging people in power, and so people who are not abusing are often not safe to speak up. So a lot of what we are doing within the organizational culture is not only giving students the education to support them in advocating for themselves, but also really giving them the experience that advocating for themselves is welcome and is something that we expect and welcome. So the other aspect of working within a school or working within an institution around preventing child sexual abuse is that too often when organizations approach child sexual abuse, they approach it as preparing for a crisis or preventing a crisis. So the shift that we are hoping to make is supporting organizations in seeing some of the work to prevent child sexual abuse as actually part of their mission and as much a part of education as helping them learn to read or helping them learn math or helping them learn to manage their money. So the work that we did within the Theme Collaborative is we did an extensive planning process in which the school, staff, leadership, other stakeholders in the school committee identified the school's core values with regard to preventing child sexual abuse. And you'll notice they are not generic values like everybody should be safe and we believe that safety is important. They are specific to the ways in which SEAM runs. SEAM, because it is a school designed for students that are not well served by a typical school setting, does not do well with simplistic rules that are to apply across the board. So when we looked at policies, there was a lot of emphasis on flexibility, being student-centered, and not being one-size-fits-all. So having accountability but not having uniformity because that does not serve the needs of the students. So in terms of policies, we see them as one tool of many in culture change. It is often the tool that gives people the recourse they need to be able to affect the change they need in the organization. So Linda talked about sort of more generic or dry bones policies. One thing that we have been working on with Theme Collaborative and with our other work is we really view a good policy as a statement of the organization's values and expectations that creates clear, consistent, meaningful accountability that helps serve the mission and supports the students that the organization serves. So some elements of an effective policy are that it's widely relevant. It's not just, oh no, we had an incident, we have to hurry up and create a policy that applies to this one incident. It's clear, it's specific. Accessibility of language is something that is very key. It's something that the organization has the resources and the political will to follow through on. And also it's consistent with the skills that people have. If we say that when somebody reports a particular type of situation, a particular action will happen, people need to be equipped to take that particular action so that it's consistent with what the organization can realistically do. There are some really important roles of policy. It can help an organization address risky or concerning or boundary violating or problematic situations before they escalate. So this is what Ashley was talking about at the beginning of the webinar about primary prevention. They can also provide clarity and consistency while communicating the organization's values and expectations. What they can't do is be a substitute for the deep organizational change and organizational culture work. It is very tempting to respond to a crisis with a policy and then decide that because we put it down on paper, we have solved the problem, but that is not any reality. Many of the organizations that make news have policies on paper. It also requires the organization to empower the people who are responsible for maintaining safety to do so. And that means even if the person who's violating boundaries is a very popular teacher or the executive director or somebody who brings in a lot of money for the organization. So really creating through policies the accountability, we need that in order for the policy to be meaningful. This I'm just going to show as kind of a generic policy. It's actually from the website of an insurance company, which is just a basic blanket zero tolerance policy. By contrast, we have the policy that STEAM Collaborative developed over a period of many months. And what is salient about this policy is that it clearly states the organization's values, the ways in which the expectations of the organization line up with what is expected of people in practice. Both addressing ensuring that students who are survivors are respected in terms of touch, and also identifying some purposes that touch can have within an organization so that other types of touch would be seen as boundary violating because they don't serve one of these purposes. So in the spirit of changing culture, we really, in the work that we do, what we look to is how the ways the larger culture, how the ways that ableism and other forms of oppression in the larger culture impact individual organizations, and what we can do within those individual organizations to create change and identify the ways in which challenging and preventing all types of abuse of power can create safety and prevent child sexual abuse. So here are our social media addresses, and thanks a lot to Ashley and to all the fellow presenters. I just want to really thank you all for including this work on the webinar.
Thank you so much, Meg. And you have been on previous Prevent Connect web conferences, and I feel like I learn so much from you every time, thinking through, I loved you talking today about what policy can do and what it can't do, and that it's really, I wrote it down and circled it. It's one tool of many when it comes to culture change. It can't be the only thing. Just because we have a good policy, it doesn't mean anything if there's nothing else happening. So I just really want to thank you for sharing the work that you're doing, and I did link to the other web conference if people want to hear more from you. I want to make sure that Ed is on the phone. Ed, are you there? Let's see. I thought I was so hopeful. Ed, you might be muted. Okay, I'm not hearing Eb. So I wanted to, we'll see, Eb, if you are on the phone, it shows that you're on the phone, but I'm not hearing you, so I'm not sure what's going on. But I wanted to let you all know a little bit about Eb, because Eb has been so gracious to join us today and will be joining us on our other
Can you hear me now?
sessions with learning.
Yes!
Oh, Eb, is that you?
Hi!
It's you!
How about that?
Okay, so hi. Let me just tell people a little bit about you, and then I'd love for you to just briefly share about JBC. So for folks who are not lucky enough to know Eb yet, Eb Brown is the founder and Chief Innovations Officer of Strategies for Freedom and is the interim program director for Just Beginnings Collaborative. Eb has spent over a decade as an educator, a social worker, and an advocate working with survivors of sexual harm, LGBTQI youth and adults, and those interfacing with state. Eb's recently published chapters in the Gender Affirmative Model, a new approach to supporting gender nonconforming and transgender children, and Invisible No More, Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color Study Guide, reflect the racial and healing justice approach embedded in all of their work. As a Black, queer, trans, non-binary leader, Eb has been invited as a consultant, facilitator, and panelist from multiple organizations, academic institutions, and centers developing movement strategy, including Harvard, Yale, the African American Policy Forum, and Move to End Violence. I'm going to put a link to where you can learn more about Eb, but Eb, we're so glad that you're here. Talk to us a little bit about JBC for folks who aren't familiar.
First of all, I just want to invite everyone, right? Like, this has been an hour and a half of talking about child sexual abuse and all the ways that people are working to move this work into a prevention space. So I just invite you to take a deep breath, right? Like knowing that there are survivors on this call, people who are working with survivors every day. As I'm talking, use this as total time to start to decompress and transition into the next thing that you have to do for your day, which may or may not be about child sexual abuse, right? Depending on where you are in the world right now. So again, my name is Eb Brown and my pronouns are he and him. And I have been with the Just Beginnings Collaborative for almost a year now. And the collaborative began as an intervention, really, to look at how could we develop a movement around child sexual abuse and support those who have been doing the work to end and prevent child sexual abuse while looking at an intersectional lens. So what you'll find with the Just Beginnings Collaborative is that many of our grantee partners, like many of the people that you've heard here today, are working at the intersections. So they might be working at the intersections. So they might be working at the intersections of faith and child sexual abuse, of ability and child sexual abuse, of race and child sexual abuse. And that has always been a core strategy of the work. The other things that you'll see is that we really wanted to strengthen the capacity of our leaders and organizations doing this work. And so with that, as grantees, they not only get a general operating support grant, but there's also several capacity building funds that they can access to build their own learning, their own development, their funding infrastructure. We knew at the very beginning of Just Beginnings Collaborative that there was very few resources in the field of child sexual abuse. And so helping to build the capacity of the organizations and the leaders doing this work was a primary and key concern, and one that we continue to carry out into this year as well. One of the goals that we have here is really thinking about creating a community of funders committed to the long-term sustainability of this work. That's been the most complicated part, right? Like even within the Me Too movement space, there's still a threshold and a barrier to really talking about child sexual assault. Our hope is as we continue to work with leader funders in the field, such as the Novo Foundation, we hope to continue to identify what are those switch points for folks to be able to say, we're willing to also provide resources to adult sexual assault, and to child sexual assault. And then finally is looking at the developing social change campaigns that specific to this issue. We really rely and support our grantees in that effort and in that work. And because each of them are doing this intersectional work, their social change campaigns look very specific for the work that they're talking about. I will just uplift Ahmad's work in this area and the idea of doing town halls in churches, right? And using town hall as a social change tool to be able to bring these conversations into spaces that they're normally not in. And so that's basically the grantee program. I will be on every time to answer questions about any of the programs. Other than the grantees that you've heard here today, we support 10 organizations and 8 individual fellows. We are actually one of the few programs in the country that provides individual grants to fellows doing leader-based work so that they could have more flexibility and fluidity in the work that they're doing. And many of our fellows you will hear from in the next Prevent Connect call. Thank you so much for being a part of this space and for being with our grantees and their work. I highly recommend looking them up, reaching out to them, and seeing what collaboration possibilities exist. You can also contact me, and I'll make
And I think we might have just lost you. But I'm going to put a link to care strategies, and we will make sure folks get your contact info. I want to thank you, Eb, for sharing. I'm sorry that we just lost you. But thank you for sharing about Just Beginnings Collaborative. I just put a link for you all to register for the next in the series that's coming up on the 23rd of this month. I want to thank all of our guests, Tashmika, Ahmad, Meg, Linda. Thank you so much for sharing about the work you all are doing for being here to have this conversation, to be part of this community. I want to thank you all so much for joining this and for sharing the work that you're doing also in your communities, your insights, your questions. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you sticking through when we had our tech issues earlier. This was recorded. The recording will be up in the next few days. We also will make the text chat without people's names attached, but we'll make that text chat transcript available. So if there's links you missed, you'll be able to get them there. If you need anything else, please feel free to reach out to me. You have my email. It's aklein@calcasa.org. And I just want to thank you all so much, wish you a wonderful rest of your Wednesday, and hope to see you on a future Prevent Connect web conference. Eb, I still don't think we can hear you, but really appreciate you being here. So that's going to end our web conference for today. Thank you all so much. Take care.